Thank you for joining me. I'm Gord Long. A reminder before we begin, do not trade from any of these slides. They're commentary for educational and discussion purposes only. Always consult a professional financial advisor before making any investment decisions. The U.S. has been on an unsustainable economic and financial path for more than 40 years now. We at Matasi have been forced to report on this, even though equity markets have been rising. Like Venezuela and many other examples, the fact is that as a country fails, its stock market typically goes up. One reason for this is that the purchasing power of a failing economy is the first and ongoing sign of failure. This reduction in purchasing power, most evident as inflation, drives financial assets up due to the depreciating purchasing power, since it takes more currency to buy the same amount of market value. There are rafts of supporting indicators that reflect a failing economy that consumes more than it produces and employs credit to sustain itself. The difference between the failure of a household and a government is simply a government can print more currency and fabricate more credit. Households and corporations have no such escape hatch. That is the bad news. The good news is that we are recently seeing early indications that this death spiral may be signaling the possibility of altering its trajectory. We'd like to share with you what we believe we are seeing as the very early signs of a possible change in direction and hope for our collective future. As such, I want to cover the items outlined here. Unfortunately, we need to start with the key bad news so we can appreciate the early green shoots of optimism. Let's start with recapping two central roadmaps the U.S. has been following. We've been outlining this roadmap for 5 years now, and in fact dedicated the 2023 thesis paper to it entitled The Great Stagnation. The sequence is one that leads economic stagnation towards economic stagflation, and we believe would eventually lead to a debt crisis before the end of the decade. Governments control the publications of their economic statistics, and it is not unusual that as economic conditions worsen, governments start distorting the reporting to hide the reality of the situation and to buy themselves more time. The U.S., unfortunately, has been a casualty of this, which I've had to endlessly report on, as the quality and accuracy of reporting continue to deteriorate, reaching the state of producing misinformation to hide the economic reality. The critical concerns for us with the reporting have centered on the employment and inflation distortions, which we'll come back to in a moment. The ongoing economic decay was also hidden by the era of the Great Moderation, as yields continue to be taken down, which boosted consumption and debt. That era ended abruptly with the post-COVID supply chain inflation bursting onto the scene, driving borrowing rates up. The post-Great Moderation era is now marked by the forced reality of higher inflation, higher borrowing costs, and exploding debt servicing costs for governments who continue to increase both their debt to GDP and their deficit to GDP levels. The long worsening economic problems have become acute and obvious to even the economic indifferent and uninformed. The second roadmap we've been on is that of seeing the U.S. and governments of other developed economies move towards what we termed as the regulatory state, which we focused on in our 2024 thesis paper. To keep failing economies alive, it is expected that governments will borrow more to sustain themselves and to pump freshly created credit into the hands of the electorate. The bread and circus strategy of pumping counterfeit clipped denarii has been the norm of failing economies since the collapse of the Roman Empire. More and more people become reliant on government support, either directly as employees or indirectly as recipients of social transfer payments. Power and influence of government expectantly expands as economic conditions worsen. Crony capitalism begins to prevail as the rich get richer and the poor fall further and further behind. Government size and scope explodes larger. The U.S. has been no exception to this well-trodden path of self-reinforcing destruction. Bloated government size, in fact, is now a major 21st century problem. What happens is governments become too big to control. The U.S. Chevron deference ruling allowed unaccountable regulatory authority in the United States. It is uncontrollably metastasized in the crack between the legislative, executive, and judicial branches of government. The regulatory state has become a fourth arm of government. Whether you call it the administrative state, the regulatory state, or the deep state, and there are slight differences in each of those, by the way, the issue is the same. It becomes unmanaged and increasingly in control. It also becomes increasingly too big to fund. The missing powers of creative destruction, lack of accountability, and stable public policy foundations within the government inevitably fosters fiefdoms, budget creep, and the avoidance of program obsolescence. Without the pressures of bankruptcy, profit motive, nor competitive pressures, bureaucracies are unfortunately inevitable. Many countries, according to IMF statistics, have governments, as shown in dark red here, that are well over 4% annual deficits. The French government just fell because it had nearly 6%, well over the 3% EU mandated maximum, with an astounding 60% of spending being that of the government itself. Goals tied to the needs of the electorate, we the people, must be consistently reinculcated towards rising standards of living, public security, and real economic growth, not to their own self-preservation. The hard reality is governments need to be continuously right-sized. Corporate America learned in the post-dot-com bubble as China entered the WTO that right-sizing, downsizing, and offshoring were central for sustainable viability. Governments are now at the same point of departure. The driving force for that departure is the taxation to spend ratio, where inflation is properly considered a hidden tax, and the deficit to GDP ratio. Government administrative operations need to be geographically distributed to maintain the tie with the electorate versus the revolving doors of government, contract workers, and the lobbying complex. Small business is critical to the vitality of a nation, but unfortunately, it itself is struggling. Small businesses with employees of between 1 and 49 employees are particularly struggling. In 2024, down 118,000 versus growing, while large businesses are booming. Employment in businesses with 20 to 49 employees is down 8 of the last 11 months in 2024, shedding a total of nearly 100,000 jobs. Year-over-year employment in small businesses is down 1.8 million in January to a mere 22,000 in November. Why are small businesses failing in 2024? Across the board, surveys find that small businesses are faced with similar challenges this year: inflation, uncertainty around the economy and elections, higher interest rates, and finding qualified people. They are facing almost insurmountable hurdles to their survival. Economic environment, particularly tough environment, regulations, compliance, costs, and competitive disadvantage, risk-reward, taxation and liabilities through litigation, labor, Gen Z expectations and attitude with this credentialized college attitude, illegal immigration, startup survival is just the cost of living to support yourself while you're in this process, and financing for existing businesses is a real problem. These are the areas taken from regional central bank surveys continuously, where they get this feedback from directly, and I used to build this list. The pre-election conclusions have been: big business has become increasingly about corporatocracy versus small business, which has always been about entrepreneurialism and self-reliance. We're losing the difference. The building blocks of America and the American dream. Big business plus government was labeled in the late 1930s as fascism by the Italian leader Benito Mussolini. We have witnessed that increasing relationship in the exercise of American power. Big business needs have increasingly been met by the government through lobbying, influence, and regulatory arbitrage at the expense of small business, the lifeblood of America. Small business has been steadily exposed to the industrialization of franchising by corporations and hollowing out what was formerly the exclusive enclaves of the mom-and-pop business sectors: hardware stores, convenience stores, restaurants, fast foods, donut shops, etc., etc. They've disappeared, while actually have been replaced by corporate franchise structures. Small businesses have increasingly been subject to profit squeeze through government overreach, crippling regulations, and compliance requirements. We're killing the golden goose that lays the egg. A sudden surge in small business confidence, however, is something we've suddenly seen. There's been a surge. The net percent of owners expecting the economy now to improve rose 41 points from October to net 36%, the highest since June 2020. This component had the greatest impact on the overall increase in the optimism index. The net percent of small business owners believing it is now a good time to expand their businesses rose 8 points to a net 14%. This is the highest reading since June 2021. What happened? What's going on here? This is how the NFIB series, asking executives whether this is a good time to expand, has moved over the last 10 years. In a nutshell, if Trump is in power or about to return to it, then it is time to expand. Otherwise, it isn't. Small businesses, that's their belief, not mine necessarily. Small business owners matter greatly. They may or may not be right to have such a confidence that a Trump administration will improve the environment for them. But they do have that. And it's possible that they're simply loyally telling pollsters that things will be better now. But animal spirits like this in crucial sectors of the economy should be a great tailwind for the new Trump administration. If companies think it's safe to invest and do so, that's the administrative battle won, no matter what policies they eventually enact. Let's now talk about what may be about to happen. That is, the potential of unshackling of America. We are beginning to see a focused narrative by the Trump administration nominees as a whole, as a group, on programs that create and instill optimism, opportunity, risk-taking, and small business relief. This is based on a fundamental shift towards productive investment in people versus fiscal investment or spending on transfer payments for consumption. I've talked endlessly about that fundamental difference in my weekly newsletters. If this is actually carried out, then we should expect to see growth in innovation and productivity. The result of the above directional approach will lead to the potential revitalization of America and the unshackling of America. A recent UK Times article featured this graph suggesting this directional thinking was fostering the rise shown, echoing what I'm seeing here. Global economic stress is showing everywhere, resulting in effectively a flight to safety. This is most evident as shown by the increasing strength of the U.S. dollar and the dramatic increase in risk capital being employed. The U.S. dollar surge has caught everybody by surprise. This has resulted in the biggest overshoot in analyst annual estimates in years. The S&P's 500 is now over 680 points above the highest 2024 year-end price target from Wall Street strategists and 25% above the average target of 48.61. However, as good as this is, the economies of China, Japan, and the EU are in trouble, and historic levels of money flows are now leading to the U.S. Things are compounding and building on themselves. What we are seeing is finally a real supply-side public plan, which has been blatantly missing for years now. Markets and economists are beginning to fully recognize that a serious rationalization of spending is the only way to prevent a debt crisis and reduce inflation in the United States. In the last estimates published by the Treasury, the accumulated deficit between 2024 and 2034 would reach $14 trillion, considering the path of uncontrolled public debt and rising fiscal irresponsibility reached over the past 4 years. Many feared a debt crisis looming. In a period of peace and prosperity, a 6.4% budget deficit indicated the lowest economic growth adjusted for debt increases since the 1930s. Market participants now appear relieved and are discounting a declining deficit as well as a stronger currency. Governments create inflation by issuing constantly depreciating currencies, eroding purchasing power through massive spending, and subsequently eroding productivity and the real value of wages and savings. Therefore, strengthening the currency and restoring confidence in public financing and reducing inflation are all part of the same policy, curbing government deficit spending. A depreciated currency is not a tool of economic growth, but a policy supported by cronyism and bureaucracies aimed at subsidizing their inefficiencies at the expense of citizens' real wages and deposit savings. For the first time in years, we may see a real supply-side plan. This administration deserves some trust, as the alternative will lead the United States into an economic catastrophe. The new administration must understand that the only way to maintain a strength of the U.S. dollar reserve status is to curb deficit spending and reduce debt while accelerating productive economic growth and private investment. Argentina's Milei has demonstrated that eliminating deficit spending can significantly reduce inflation. The United States needs to implement drastic measures to eliminate the bloated expenditure past of the past 4 years and restore confidence in the solvency of the public sector. Change is underway. The president-elect has wasted no time in assembling his team of disciples, and you can break their forces of change down into 4 discrete buckets: justice, health, national security, and economic revitalization. I've talked about the changes underway in these areas in my weekly newsletter. If President-elect Trump gets his way, his second term could be historic, potentially. Throw in government waste, cuts and removal, projects spearheaded by entrepreneurs Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, and you are well on your way to a potential revolution on the fourth arm of the separation of power, the administrative state, or what I wrote about in my 2024 thesis paper, the regulatory state. So, what conclusions is this leading us towards? Well, there is little doubt if you delve into the details, there is at least a strategic plan here. The nearly 1,000-page Project 2025 outlines the plan in detail, and the Trump transition teams are committed to it, and more importantly, maybe, to Trump versus heading in different directions, which we have witnessed in prior administration. The plan is anchored in the re-privatization of the U.S. economy. Stop false and unproductive economic growth, stop the distortion of capital allocation, and restore faith in the U.S. economy and dollar. It's critical. These are fundamental, but they have not been cornerstones of policy. We're seeing that they are cornerstones of policy. Whether that's delivered is certainly something we will have to watch. We discussed all of these in our latest Under the Lens video. It has the likelihood of being a winning strategy. Implementation is another story, as well as the hurdles that must be overcome. The challenges are frankly monumental. However, unless America gains significant traction with reshoring, then America is doomed to the inevitable debt crisis. America can no longer consume more than it produces. America must produce more than it consumes. And that's what the revitalization is about. It's actually about reshoring, as I talked about in a prior video, and bringing more and more producing companies back to America. As I've long held, money and wealth is created by mining it, building it, growing it, or producing it. It isn't created by printing it. The real questions needing answers now are, will tariffs, tax incentives, deregulation, and equity funding deliver the reshoring? Can the imperative of taming inflation and creating family-supporting jobs happen? Are we betting the country? I think we are, but do we have any other bet? Can all the changes be done in 18 months and before the midterms remove the House control? Likely not, but will there be enough positive change to maybe continue to have that House? It's a very short window that must be taken full advantage of. We will see, and we will watch this very closely, praying that things work, at least getting us back towards a sustainable future. As I always remind you in these videos, remember, politicians and central banks will print the money to solve any and all problems until such time as no one will take the money or it is of no value. That day is still in the future, so take advantage of the opportunities as they currently exist. Investing is always easier when you know with relative certainty how the powers to be will react. Your chances of success go up dramatically. The powers to be are now effectively trapped by policies of fiat currencies, unsound money, political polarization, and overall global policy paralysis. I'd like to take a moment as a reminder, do not trade from any of these slides. They're for educational and discussion purposes only. As negative as these comments often are, there's actually seldom been a better time for investing. However, it requires careful analysis and not necessarily following what has traditionally been the true and tried approaches. Do your reading and make sure you have a knowledgeable and well-informed professional financial advisor. So until we talk again, may 2024 turn out to have been an outstanding investment year for you and your family. I sincerely thank you for listening.